want to introduce Tonia Winchester. She was the outreach coordinator for the New Approach campaign in Washington. That was, of course, very successful, and one of the 2 states has made history by legalizing marijuana. If you did her talk earlier, you know a little bit more about her, but she's a former prosecutor who's come to this from a different path than many of us might have come to this issue. And I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say, and it's been good meeting you so far. So I'll turn it over to you without further ado. Thank you.
So I like to move around the stage, so I'm just going to use this time preset. First of all, I just wanted to thank Dana for the introduction, as well as the rest of Sensible BC for bringing me up here. It was very exciting. I learned a lot and a lot of really great people. Anita really was great at organizing. I think there's a lot of behind the scenes that goes on, and I just wanted to give a shout out to her because I spent more time talking with her. Tammy and Nick for just their inspiration. I don't know if anyone got Tammy's power ring, but if you haven't got one yet, you should. It's very sweet for her to give us something to take away from this, to remind us, that we have our own power, and that we need to remember that we need to not only take it from this weekend, but we need to take it out into our lives in general, but also about cannabis and ending cannabis prohibition. And I wanted to thank Sensible BC. I gave a shout out during my my presentation. Washington was really fortunate. We had the benefit of being able to use paid signature gatherers to really help make 502 possible. We had a great volunteer effort as well, but I just wanted to say that the effort that you guys did last year was really commendable as far as the quagmire that you really had to jump through in order to gather signatures, and I really think that you guys should give yourselves a round of applause for the work that you guys did. So Dana and Amita asked me to give an inspirational speech, something to take from the end of this weekend and really kind of move forward. So I'm going to leave some time for people to ask questions about Washington State's initiative. I know there is some questions about kind of what we did and my participation in that if you weren't able to come to my workshop. So I don't want to preach to the choir because I think you guys are pretty motivated enough. I think you guys have some great enthusiasm. I think the fact that you guys are here and you care about this issue and you've sat through these workshops and you're still here at the end and listen to me talk just goes to show that you're dedicated to seeing some change. And so I just want to provide, I don't know why speakers only have ever 3 things to say. I'm going to provide 3 things that I just wanted to touch on to help you guys just root and ground all of this in for this final few hours that you guys are here. First thing is you need to meet people where they're at. You need to meet the community where they're at. You need to meet Canadians where they're at. You need to meet your family and your friends about this issue where they're at. Are they scared of cannabis? Do they hate cannabis? Do they not like cannabis? Do they think it smells or it stinks or they don't particularly enjoy anything about it? If that's where they are, you have to meet them there. Trying to drag them over to the I love cannabis right away, it just won't work. I'm not saying they won't get there. I'm not saying that by sharing your story and actually articulating the profound experience you've had with cannabis or the situations of your other friends and the experience you've had meeting people here today won't move them. But you can't expect people to change like this. 75 years of prohibition has done a pretty good job scaring people. I joked about it in my workshop. I'm the only successful DARE program graduate that I know in the entire United States because it worked on me. Nancy Reagan's Don't Do Drugs worked on me. I didn't do drugs through high school. I was the one that organized the Friday Night Live kind of a nights out where you'd camp out in the dormitories or the gyms and you'd play games and have fun and carnivals because you don't want to go out and do drugs, right? You didn't want to be one of those kids. And that was me. And there's a lot of people that come from that. There's a lot of people that's still their story. My mother, we had this tenant situation when I was growing up in Alaska and they smoked pot. My mom really didn't like it and I remember watching her being kind of unsure of how to handle that situation. And that was my impression. That's where I started from. So my story started in that place. Don't do drugs, they're bad for you. And it worked on me. And then I went to college and I met people and I expanded my horizons and I met really smart, articulate engineers and programmers and people who had ambition and really, things that just didn't connect with that story that I had. And so I had to start thinking differently. But I can tell you right now, my opinion about prohibition and cannabis didn't change because someone told me to change my opinion. How many people will do what someone else says if they just tell them to do it? I mean, no one, right? I mean, exactly, right? Like, if you've had kids or relationships or parent relationships, you know, the surest fire way of getting them to do the exact opposite of what you want them to do is tell them what you want them to do. So for me, I learned from people sharing their stories. And so that's the next part, is share your story. Know what your motivation is, but don't get wrapped up in other people's motivations. And don't require your motivation to be their motivation. I'm gonna read a quote that I really, really enjoy. It's from Alice Huffman. She is, for those of you who don't know, she's the president of the California NAACP. She came up to Washington State and did a symposium during the 502 campaign, and she quoted and said this during her presentation. She said, "Anytime the government has a law that oppresses your people, we are supposed to rise up and change it. I don't care what their motivation is. Don't get caught up in their motivation. When whites and blacks fought together to end slavery, I'm sure some of them had different motives for being in the abolitionist movement. We didn't care. Some people said Abraham Lincoln didn't free us because he loved blacks. He freed us to save the country. I don't care. I'm free. I don't care what their motive is." One of the key important things that I've learned, particularly in the 502 campaign, was I couldn't care what other people's motives were. If they didn't like pot, that was fine. I wanted to talk to them about what we were doing and how we were doing it was causing more harm than good. And then in the vacuum of them agreeing with me on that point, provide a new direction. Taxation and regulation. I know a lot of people in here are not a fan of that, but that's where Washington voters were. Taxation and regulation. Free up law enforcement to focus on more violent crimes, and take it out of the hands of the cartels and put it in the hands of community members so that they can ensure that we're not causing more harm than the damage that we've caused because of the war on drugs. And that's a hard place to be. It's a hard place to really believe in something so much, and people don't agree with why you believe in it. But here's the thing, if we want to affect the change that I know everyone in this room wants to see happen, we have to understand that people aren't going to agree with us and why we want to and why they want to do it. I don't care. I just want to end prohibition. I want people to be able to do what they want to do, choose what they want to be able to do with their own bodies, and not be regulated or controlled or put in jail. At the time that 502 was passed, it was a mandatory 1 day in jail and a $500 fine for individuals for a small marijuana possession, anything less than 40 ounces. And I did that. I put people in jail. I actually have a memory of sitting in Wenatchee, and I was looking at a pile of domestic violence cases, and I had all of these marijuana charges right before me because, as everyone knows, a marijuana charge is pretty easy to prove. Possession's pretty easy to prove. As a prosecutor, I could, move those really quickly. It didn't require a lot of investigation or interviews or things like that. And I remember thinking to myself, I should be doing something different. I should be doing something in a different way. And that's how I got involved in 502. And I got to that point, again, not because someone told me to think differently, not because someone told me, Tonia, you really need to try pot, it's awesome, you'll love it. I got there because people told me, maybe what you're thinking, here's a different way, just from their stories. So know your own motivation, really write it down. During my workshop, I had people write down their motivation. Write it down so you can go back to it. I know we don't write letters anymore, but you can write a letter and send it to yourself in the mail, or have a friend mail it to you in 6 months so you can be reminded, because this is really hard. This is hard work. This is challenging work to change 75 years of prohibition, to change this flow of the way that we've been doing something. Because people are really scared of change. People like the status quo. It's comfortable, it's easy, it doesn't require them to flex or move or be any kind of modification of their own behavior. They just be, I'm here and I'm comfortable with what I'm doing. What we're trying to do is actually do something different. That's really what we're trying to do. And I want to make sure we understand that prohibition really has failed. I want to remind people of that. There hasn't been a lot of talk about that over the weekend in specificity. There are 60,000 deaths that were caused in the last 5 years. from Americans' use of cannabis alone in Mexico. Like there's a harm being caused, right? And that harm, I think everyone can agree, is the desired results of what we wanted prohibition to accomplish, people not using cannabis, didn't really get accomplished. So we can try something new. You have to give them the new. You can't just say, this failed, let's throw it out, because then you create a vacuum, and then it's just kind of a chaotic space. People like the new. I know that Dana and his leadership for Sensible BC are going to be working on kind of what education information are going to be going into that. What's a new way that we can go about handling prohibition, handling cannabis? What's a way to end that? The last thing I want to say is you need to acknowledge your accomplishments. So, and I can answer questions about this, but I spent 6 months working up in Nanaimo, British Columbia, setting up a 6,000 square foot medical marijuana production facility under the new MMPR regulatory structure. I know the regulatory structure pretty well, and I have to say that Canada did a really amazing job of allowing the market to really just kind of take it to where it needs to be for right now. It's pretty amazing that if you're a medical patient in Canada, that you can order cannabis online and it's delivered by Canada Post to your front door. Does everyone realize that that's actually happening out there right now? I know it seems not what you want and not the final end, but that's pretty amazing that a patient can go to a doctor, get a prescription, register with multiple licensed producers. You can have multiple prescriptions and get your cannabis depending on the strain that you want from different licensed producers. And that's actually delivered to your door, and that's legal. I mean, you can't do that anywhere else in the world. I mean, that's just an amazing accomplishment. So let's talk about meeting Canadians where they are, right there. They're comfortable with that. Canadians are comfortable with MMPR for the most part. The majority of Canadians are comfortable with that concept and comfortable with that idea. And I think it's really important that we celebrate the fact that that's really exciting. I mean, there's states in the United States that I would go to and I would tell that to them and they were just like, no way. I do not want that at all, and it would never pass. So I am really proud of you guys for establishing and creating a model that's really easily switched over to recreational cannabis. Very easily switched over. And there's a hope here in Canada that I don't see necessarily across the United States for federal recreational cannabis. Some people don't like when you say, I know Dana's kind of saying, I don't want to talk about, we're almost there, but you guys are almost there. And you've done it through hard work. You've done it through really challenging yourselves, challenging your communities, and then challenging your local law enforcement and government to start thinking about it in just a different way and in a better way. So I just really wanted to say that you guys really have inspired me over the last weekend. I've never seen kind of such genuine enthusiasm for cannabis in a really long time, and enthusiasm for changing the way that BC looks at cannabis. But I did want to open it up to questions if anyone had any about myself or the Washington campaign.
Thank you very much. Now, my question is around the regulations that might be coming down the pike. Is there any thought to creating a private model for regulatory control, similar in BC to the VQA system, than just Quality Alliance or cottage wines? I think I can see cottage buds,
Mm-hmm.
And
you're asking about Canada, yes? Just making sure you're...
Yeah, in respect, Washington, just wondering what law you're undertaking.
So addressing Washington State, a private alliance, no, I think for the most part, we're going to be looking at a regulatory structure from the state level for quite some time. It's very similar to the alcohol model that we have in Washington State, so I can't necessarily see private regulation completely, overtaking that. That's answering your question. I do know that there's a huge influx of private investment. We've talked about the corporatization of cannabis. I went into the business sector after passing 502 because I really believe that legitimate business with socially minded and responsible practices really are going to be a linchpin in ensuring that prohibition can be successful. Because if you don't have legitimate businesses that are providing cannabis to patients and recreationally, you're just going to see more people keep going into the black market. So you have to really have that surface business. And so Canada's done a great job in that. The licensed producer system, I know, has had a lot of positive and negatives, but the reality is there are licensed producers out there that are registering patients and providing consistent quality cannabis to them. You know, there's a huge area of Canada that is not, shall I say, as liberal or as progressive in their cannabis policy and acceptance as British Columbia is. And so we're seeing territories where people are actually able to get cannabis that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to under the MMAR. Oh, there's, sorry, microphone guy.
Right now in Colorado and Washington, although you're allowed to buy recreational cannabis, there's no place that you can actually smoke it except for on private. Is there any sort of campaign to try to allow like vapor lounges or smoking in bars or other types of freedom?
Yeah, I know in Colorado there are movements for that. I'm not too particularly involved in that. Wish Mason was still here, he could answer that. In Washington, you know, Washington voters are pretty anti-smoking in general, as you know, as a strict concept. We have a 20-foot rule. You know, I think somewhere here in British Columbia, you're not allowed to do that. So I think maybe in a while we'll see like the ability for that, but it's not a priority. The priority right now is to ensure that there's reliable and consistent access to recreational cannabis, that producers or processors are able to meet the demand, because that's been a huge challenge right now, just as far as the amount of cannabis that's needed to meet the demand, you know, and allowing the prices to really, you know, normalize so that it's, you know, a viable option for most people rather than just going into the black market. So I think there's a little more time before that kind of conversation happens, but I don't think that conversation is moot. I just think it maybe is not well timed at this point.
Thank you.
Right here.
I got a mic.
I think, yeah, James.
I got my own mic.
Yeah.
I just had a couple of questions about some of the decisions that were made in terms of the actual legislation that was passed. Obviously, there was controversy, and some marijuana activists were very much against the initiative. And the couple of things, it was the driving, the setting a fixed nanogram limit for driving, I know was very controversial. And also the question about whether you could grow at home. I know you can grow at home as a medical marijuana patient in Washington, all that's being sort of discussed maybe now, but you can't grow at home unless you got a medical permit. I'm curious if, in retrospect, looking back on that, whether you think those were like, that was a good idea to put in the driving thing, and without it, it wouldn't have passed, or maybe it would have passed anyway, maybe you didn't need to do that, or what your perspective is looking back on it now about those kind of controversial issues.
Right. So just to provide some background as to what Dana is talking about, Washington's Initiative 502 had two provisions. One of the provisions was the DUI provision, which created a per se limit. In Washington State, you basically have a conditional right or conditional privilege to drive. That condition is based on you agreeing to, you know, basically getting stopped if an officer believes that you're driving while impaired. Doing a breathalyzer, you're mandated to do that, or your license will be suspended if you don't take the breathalyzer, if they believe having a suspicion that you're driving while impaired. And there's a 0.08 for alcohol blood level that was established, I believe, 10 years ago. And so we added a 5 nanograms of active THC per se limit in 502, and then we didn't allow home grow in 502. If you were a medical marijuana patient, you could continue to grow on your own. It did breed a lot of conflict from within the medical cannabis community. It might not be something you guys are aware of, but the #1 opposition that we had for 502 actually came from the cannabis community, the medical marijuana community. In retrospect, I don't think we did anything, and I think we should have and did exactly what we should have done. Proposition 19, which was in California, when people were doing exit polls, the #1 reason why they said that they didn't vote for it was because there was no DUI provision. Mothers Against Drunk Driving came out against it, saying that it was just going to put more impaired drivers on the road. Again, this comes back to having to meet people where they're at. Washington voters liked the additional security and protection that it came from responsibly legalizing a substance, but then also putting appropriate repercussions for abuse that jeopardized public safety. We haven't seen an increase in drug DUIs since 502 passed, so kind of the naysayers that were concerned there'd be this huge influx of drug DUIs, we haven't really seen that. And it didn't really change the way law enforcement practiced their law enforcement. So an officer still had to have reasonable suspicion that you were driving impaired. They had to point to articulable facts that showed why they thought you were driving impaired. They had to show why they thought it was something that wasn't alcohol, because if they thought it was alcohol, they would just take you down to the station and have you do a breathalyzer. So none of those practices have changed, and again, we haven't really seen an increase in drug DUIs. And I think it gave Washingtonians the assurance for those that are still scared of cannabis and are still scared of people driving while impaired, that we were meeting them where they were at. As far as the home grow provision, again, polling showed that Washington voters just weren't ready to have people being able to grow cannabis whenever they wanted, wherever they wanted for their own personal use. We equated it very much to the alcohol model. You're not allowed to brew your own bathtub gin anymore in Washington state without some kind of license or permit if you're doing it for like distillery purposes.
You can make beer and wine probably though, right?
You can, yeah, but I don't know a lot of people that do that for, you know, all the beer that they drink. I mean, I've been to parties where they've done brewing and it's been very fun, but you know, people aren't doing that as the sole mechanism of getting what they want when it comes to alcohol. So yeah, I think you have to meet voters where they're at, and you know, medical patients who have that need can still, you know, grow on their own. But recreationally, you know, I don't know anyone that's selling gin on the corner, you know, just because it's $2 cheaper.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. You got one.
Yeah, one of my concerns is, I heard you guys charge 25% tax. And here you're talking about the underground. You're causing the underground by making the price so high.
Well, the underground already exists.
No, but if you reduce the price, the underground can't afford to grow because there's no profit.
No, I understand that. So, I mean, we're talking about a commodity that has a ridiculous margin of profit right now. I mean, if you look at eggplants or tomatoes, you know, those growers, when they are planning their harvest schedule, they are micromanaging every single little piece of labor and, you know, equipment and expense to minimize their costs so they can increase their profits. And we're talking about maybe, you know, $1, $2 margin of profit. I mean, cannabis has a ridiculously high margin of profit. So it's prohibition that's caused those prices in the first place. So it's really hard to start answering that question where you would like me to.
But the taxes are gonna keep the price
I understand that, but it's hard to.
The gangsters in it.
The problem is that prohibition is what's created those inflated prices anyway, and we have to create a model that actually produces the income that we need to see for research, for health prevention, for drug prevention, for education and research. And the way you do that is by a taxation model. In Washington state, the taxation model for cannabis is very similar to alcohol. It actually proves out to be a little bit less. If you're a producer processor, you can actually incorporate the 25% within your own, within that stage. So it really doesn't turn out to be the major issue in that regard. Right now what Washington facing is we need to have more producer processors actually licensed so we can actually have more product in the market.
I have a question. Thanks for being here, by the way.
Yeah, of course.
I had a chance to see the long list of politicians, local politicians in Washington who were supporting the initiative there. I mean, it was huge. It's probably the largest list of local politicians I've ever seen support any initiative to do with marijuana anywhere ever. We've had trouble doing similar things here. How did the outreach campaign to the politicians look? How did you do that?
Lots of time and energy, but there's a huge amount of groundwork that was laid beforehand. So Initiative 502, prior to even being filed, Alison Holcomb, who's the campaign director and drug policy director at the ACLU of Washington, as well as other organizations, really laid a huge kind of ground game work as far as establishing the 10 sponsors, and that was really huge. So 502 was sponsored by 10 prominent individuals within the community, including John McKay, Pete Holmes, who is the Seattle City Attorney, various other law enforcement and drug policy individuals, 2 MDs. So those conversations were happening long before 502 was even even filed. And there's been a huge ground movement for cannabis legalization from the very beginning. I mean, there was 3 other initiatives that were filed and signatures attempted to be gathered. So this conversation's been happening for a really long time. But I have to admit, it was Allison Holcomb and her work prior to 502 actually getting filed, where she's having private conversations with people, meeting them where they're at, asking about what their concerns are, doing substantial polling prior to filing an initiative to really see, again, where are Washington voters at? And what can we do to reassure them? I mean, 502 is really a reassurance campaign. People, when they were polled, had a visceral negative reaction towards cannabis. The majority of people didn't actually support or like cannabis, but they realized that prohibition wasn't working. So when you have people who know that what we're doing isn't working and need to change it, you really just have to provide them a reassurance campaign that they can deviate from the status quo and that the world won't fall apart and it won't just become hell on earth, right? That's what people were scared of. If we open this box, what's gonna happen? And so it really was a reassurance campaign. And we just met with lots of people. I made more phone calls than I can possibly imagine. The asks that we made were very minimal. We don't need you to come on tour with us. We just want to put your name up on the website. Do you support it? We don't need you to write an op-ed piece, but we just want you to be someone that we can point to as being from this community supporting 502. Rick Steves, for those of you who know or don't know Rick Steves, huge travel writer and very good following amongst a very interesting demographic, so traditionally an older demographic. Huge. We went on a barnstorming tour all across Washington State, and people knew it was the right thing to do, and they felt safe enough with that reassurance from the campaign that they could say that they supported it.
I get what I was getting specific, or what I really am interested in is, was there a particular set of data, because we're talking, there's a big, huge difference between convincing the public and convincing the politicians themselves.
Right.
Was it part of using some particular set of data? I mean, the Rick Steves thing is a great example. Social proof that other big names were involved in this as well, I guess that obviously helps getting the politicians on side. But did you guys have data you brought to them that was convincing or something?
I think it just came down to the fact that what we're doing isn't working. I mean, politicians are smart and they see that, and they're all about freedom. I mean, our message for 502 was very strategic and very simple. Free up law enforcement to focus on more violent crime, take it out of the hands of the cartels, and generate revenue that can be used to better purposes. I mean, that was a consistent message, and that was a message that politicians could get behind. It really wasn't some magic bullet. We did talk a lot about the relationship between education and tobacco use. So we have been able to reduce youth use of tobacco without arresting a single person. And how have we done that? We've done that through education and information and campaigns that talk about tobacco in a smart way. So we can do things differently without using law enforcement and the criminal justice system as the only way.
Thank you.
Next question. If Justin Trudeau is our next leader, and he calls you up for advice, and he says, how should we do it, based on the lessons that you can learn from both Washington and Colorado, what would you advise him?
Good question. I think the MMPR is actually a really great platform and baseline, and I would start there, and I would just turn the MMPR into a recreational cannabis. If you want to order it, you can apply and register, or maybe there won't be a registration process and you would just be able to purchase it online. And then I think that it would be up to the individual provincial governments to decide how they want to integrate that into a hands-on level. Do you want to allow for stores, for dispensary or access points? Do you want those licensed producers to be able to have stores or access points?
Home growing, that's what we want.
What's that?
Home growing is what we want.
Or if home growing is something that they want to allow, and I think your court system is probably going to be the one that's deciding that more so than Justin Trudeau necessarily. But I mean, that would be my advice. Like, start where you're at. We wouldn't reinvent the wheel, and take where you're comfortable with being right now, and then just expand it as appropriate. There might be backlash, right? That's the reason why I'm saying it that way. But the country has to be ready, in my opinion, for whatever is going to happen. Depends on how he legalizes it. If he just says it's legal, then it's just legal. What would your advice be?
Very long and complicated.
Very long and complicated.
It's not a short answer.
Not a short answer. I mean, and it is more complicated than that, right? It's a much more convoluted answer. But for me, you have a system right now that would easily be switched over to recreational.
Thanks very much for your help here today. Quick question, you mentioned 3 specific arguments or issues identified to promote success of your 502 campaign. Are those applicable here in Canada from your perspective, and what other issues do you think we should be focusing on to be in line with more or less where people are at specifically, so that they would in fact sign a petition or vote for a candidate who would support what we're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think those 3 messages work universally, because I think the war on drugs really has affected every nation in a very similar fashion. Some countries with more devastating results, with people dying, within their own borders. But I really think that, realizing that law enforcement spending their time arresting people for small amounts of cannabis possession really is not a good use of our resources. There's home invasions, there's murders, there's real harm being done to individuals. And I think we could all say that we would want our communities to be safer. I don't think anyone wants an unsafe community. But where should law enforcement be putting those resources? And I think that that's just a really universal message, whether you're in the United States or in Canada. I think taking it out of the hands of the cartels is a legitimate response. I guess here you would say Hells Angels and other organized crimes. But again,
they're not organized crime.
they're not
They're a
organized crime.
motorcycle club.
They're a
You're
motorcycle
thinking of
club.
the cartels and the pharmaceutical companies.
Okay. So I think that message still resonates. And then, lastly, taxing and generating revenue to be used in, better means. And the irony is that there's no tax right now from a licensed producer's perspective. They only pay the GST tax on the sale, but there's no actual tax. So it's interesting, Canada's taken an even more capitalistic approach to marijuana at this particular point in time. So yeah, I think that they resonate. I think when the conversation changes, it's on the one-on-one level. But from a campaign perspective, I would say that those work. I am personally not an advocate of the cannabis is safer than alcohol model. I think that it opens up too many responses from individuals who don't like alcohol in the first place. And then the retort is, why would I want one more mind-altering substance made legal? I don't like alcohol in the first place. And I think then the conversation stops. So for me, cannabis may be safer and there may be no death caused by that, but I'm not sure you win over conservatives by telling them that.
Yeah, well, the chances are slim you're gonna win a conservative war anyway. What you have to do is get all the people who are not conservatives to realize that as far as it goes, this is a medicine. It is helpful to put people. I myself, as I constantly maintain to people, I get 1,200 grams a month free. I can smoke up to 40 grams a day legally. If it could hurt anybody, it would have killed me.
Any other questions?
In designing Washington's model for distribution, how were the players, stakeholders chosen, and who chose them?
So that was done prior to mine during the campaign, and again, it was Allison Holcomb and her work that she's been doing as ACLU Drug Policy Director. She'd been working with Pete Holmes and other individuals within the 502 sponsor group on various other initiatives. So Seattle had a low, basically a decrim initiative that got passed where voters basically told prosecutors in Seattle, we don't think you should be prosecuting people for medical marijuana or marijuana use at all. It didn't become law, but the prosecutor took that into consideration and stopped prosecuting for marijuana possession charges. So it really was an outreach campaign. Rick Steves has been a huge advocate for marijuana legalization for quite some time. He's probably one of the only people I know that loves talking about how he enjoys smoking cannabis.
Was it the state liquor board that's assigned those specific people?
No, not at all. Liquor Control Board at the time that 502 was passed was just going through, we had an alcohol repeal. So alcohol used to be very similar to what is in Canada right now. You could only buy it in state-run stores. You couldn't get it in grocery stores. And there was an initiative that got passed, 1083, that basically eradicated the Liquor Control Board's regulation of state-run stores, and alcohol went into individual, 7-Elevens and things like that. And so they had nothing to do with it. This was strictly New Approach Washington and that coalition of individuals and those funders that put 502 together.
Who gave them the authority to do that?
So Initiative 502 is a statutory change that provided the Liquor Control Board with the authority to make all the rules. As far as New Approach Washington was concerned, we have an initiative, we have a right to initiative in Washington State. So any person can file an initiative petition, you just have to collect enough signatures. So it was simply a coalition of like-minded individuals who wanted to see some change, and they structured it as New Approach Washington. Yeah, way in the back.
Jobs, that's one of the big arguments we're gonna have to come up with. And in another session, I just heard a very good case for the black market, because it pays very well here. And we all want a living wage, and we wanna keep our communities vibrant where, once it comes out of the shadows. And this is a big concern. Did you see that?
Yeah, well, the irony, I mean, in Canada, the licensed producers are producing a lot of jobs. I mean, in Nanaimo alone, I know Tilray produced over 80 jobs within the first 6 months it was open. And these are legitimate, living wage jobs where, people would come to work every day and they're like, man, I've been growing in my basement for years. I can't believe I get to do this, and everyone knows about it. So I think legitimate business, and this is why I went from the campaign to the private sector. So I really think legitimate business, people are willing to invest money and capital and trying true business practices into elevating the conversation and creating quality products. The market can eradicate the black market. The legitimate market can eradicate the black market with time and sufficient support. So I think jobs really will just go from the black market to the legal market eventually, and you'll be able to produce potentially more, or under different circumstances where people can not have to hide that they're working for a cannabis grow.
And what about free trade?
What about free trade? You want cannabis to be part of NAFTA's next negotiations?
Well, that's a big fear. If we legalize it, then the rest of the world goes, yay, we can import.
I don't see why cannabis shouldn't be traded like any other commodity, to be quite honest. And I think we'll get there that one day, but again, we're talking about where we're at and meeting people where we're at. The problem when you start talking about that is people get scared. People go back into their shell of fear when it comes to cannabis. I'm not discounting that. I think it's a great idea. And I think one day we'll be like, wow, there's a cannabis commodities exchange and it's trading at, $7.50 a gram. Like, I better buy into that. I don't know what the future holds in that model, but I don't see why it shouldn't be that way. And I think
That was never a fear thing.
What's that?
When it came up, that was never an issue with trade and.
So the U.S. government, Department of Justice, they issued an opinion, a whole memo that came out after 502 passed, and Colorado had Initiative 64 on the books, or Amendment 64 on the books, and basically said, here are 8 concerns. Don't do anything that's going to make those concerns become legitimate concerns, and we're just going to turn, kind of a blind eye really at what you guys are doing in Washington, Colorado. And one of them was diversion. So there was a huge concern upon the liquor control boards, as well as the federal government, as well as the 502 backers, as to diversion. We don't want to see, Washington product show up in other states. But in a weird way, would that be so wrong? I don't think so. I don't think it's bad, potentially, that cannabis shows up in Illinois or Wisconsin. It's packaged, it's tested, it's, we know where it came from. I mean, as a parent, I'd rather have my kids smoking, pot from Colorado or Washington if I live in Florida, than some, street drug that I'm not sure where it comes from. So I understand that concern, and there's a legitimate work being done to make sure that there's no diversion. And you'll be prosecuted if you divert outside of Washington.
We have time for just one more question.
Perfect, thank you for keeping track of time. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for coming to thank you. With all due respect to you, I'm not necessarily due to Washington. I like to take issue with just one thing. When we are speaking all the time, or you're speaking all the time of alcohol and cannabis, are you not speaking of apples and oranges? Alcohol is, for example, gin from potatoes. It is distilled, changes its chemical mechanism, and cannabis is simply dried, used, or the life force, just like aromatherapy, comes out in cannabis oil. The chemicals aren't changed, and it isn't the same. I think alcohol should closely be likened to cocaine that's fermented in the ground for months, changed. You don't have concentrated potato and everyone's going crazy about it. It has to be changed. So that's not the case in cannabis. So why is it even affected by some alcohol?
So personally, we never brought up alcohol during the 502 campaign, and I'm not a fan of any comparisons. I don't think it's appropriate to compare marijuana and methamphetamine, or marijuana and cocaine, or marijuana and other drugs, despite my opinion on where I think everything should be in the model. I don't believe in making a comparison between cannabis and alcohol. What I do believe is that that's the closest relationship that people can understand when it comes to a regulatory model. And that's where Washington used alcohol, in the sense of, we had a liquor control board that regulated alcohol, and we were asking the liquor control board to create a similar regulatory structure and model for cannabis. That's where that comparison came in for 502. We didn't use it as a comparison between the substances themselves. You're welcome.
No, I'm simply saying that apples or peaches are just wonderful, but then don't have to be regulated.
But they are,
It's just
ironically
a
enough.
natural substance like meat.
You're actually
But
trying
that-
to
but I
compare
mean-
penicillin with oranges. See, you know, they're totally two different things, but they're insisting that they're the same thing, because that oranges are good for you and penicillin is good for you. It's a bad analogy, but it doesn't get off the top of my head.
Thank you guys so much for your time.
I really appreciate your talk and your perspective and the comparison between you and Mason Tvert and the two different approaches and the ways of doing things. And I find a lot of what you say really challenging, because saying things like, well, the LPs are really good and you should move in that direction. Most of us here in this room hate the LPs, don't like that system at all. But I really appreciate your perspective and those ideas and meeting them where they are, incremental change and moving forward. Thank you so much for your presentation and for your earlier workshop today as well. Thank you very much. Yeah! All right.